Hello! Hello and welcome to another episode of the Game Audio Hour. This is a fortnightly podcast where we discuss all things game audio, from creative ideas to the latest techniques, project experiences to audio secrets. Here is where you'll find in-depth coverage and opinions related to game audio. And you'll also find these wonderful individuals over here. We have Alex, we have Mike. It's a fight. Who's going to introduce themselves first?
Hello.
Alex, how are you doing?
I'm quick on the button. I'm very well, thanks, Vince. How are you?
I am not bad. It is a really nice, warm, and balmy summer right now for me, which I wasn't expecting. SoCal is supposed to be a desert, so why is this hot air so damn moist right now? Not very happy about that. Mike, are you experiencing similar things up the freeway from me?
I am, though I think we should specify that moist by SoCal standards is like 10% humidity. So we're so used to the bone dry desert air, then any deviation from that feels like we're swimming in soup. But for someone who lives on the east coast of the US, this is probably not oppressive as we feel it.
Oh man.
You guys should try Japan. Oh boy. It's like you got cheese growing out of your hair and mushrooms on your back of the neck and like moss, just like literally moss everywhere.
Well, I'm actually checking the weather right now. It is legit moist. It says 76% humidity where I live. So it's, honestly, it's pretty uncomfortable for me. And I'm pretty used to the tropical hot weather that happens in East and Southeast Asia. So, yeah, I'm not a big fan of this. But I am a fan of being able to get out of the segment without Alex making some joke about Celsius versus Fahrenheit. So let's keep on going with that and actually go right into some game audio talk, shall we? Let's do it.
Yeah, that's fine. I didn't need to say hello. Just go on.
Oh, man. Oh, sorry. I mean, I'm so excited about, like, getting away with that. All right. Mike.
Nice try.
Yeah, you're doing okay? You're doing great?
Maybe I don't want to talk about it now.
Oh, no. Okay.
No, I'm doing fine. As I was telling Alex, there are now 2 raccoons and 1 possum and at least 2 cats that itinerantly travel through my backyard. So it's never a dull moment around here.
Excellent. Raccoons, possums. Ooh. I don't want to deal with that. I've had to deal with that a little bit too much lately. In our neighborhood, there are some swimming pools, and I hear the swimming pool activity at night. It's not kids hanging out in the swimming pools. It's possums, it's raccoons. Those critters, they like escaping the heat as well, and I don't like thinking about that much, though. No, those are our swimming pools, damn it. Okay. Let's move on, though. Let's do some game audio chat. And something that has been on my mind recently, because honestly, equipment and gear, it generally tends to stick on my mind, is computers. What the hell am I going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to upgrade to? And of course, there are some cool things that I see on Facebook, on Twitter, composers and sound designers showing off their new wares. Things like the new Mac Pro, which is kind of crazy, kind of awesome, kind of a big investment. I think the minimum Mac Pro configuration is a $6,000 beast of a machine. And you could easily get that well into the 5-digit range. And that's a little bit scary, especially when you consider that there's all this other stuff on the horizon. During that last Apple conference, they were talking about how they will make a transition to using Apple Silicon. In other words, not Intel. And that's a little bit scary to me. I'm not sure what to do. I'm not sure what that really means for the future or how I should consider my upgrade path. What do you guys think? Mike, I know that you're very much an Apple Mac user. So have you given this a lot of thought recently?
I have, because although my 2013 Mac Pro, aka the trash can, has held up admirably, there is going to be some point where the demands of modern sample libraries start to exceed what it can do comfortably. So I've kept my eye on the development of the iMac Pro and the recent Mac Pro. And there's a weird mixed message because, on one hand, as you say, the Mac Pro is a big chunk of change to invest in a computer, and you want to feel like you've got the latest and greatest. And if you buy one of those things, you don't want it to be obsolete. And so to have that high-end workstation released and then a few months later to have Apple say, by the way, we're about to release a new class of processor that's going to be leaps and bounds above everything we're offering now is a little bit strange. And I think it would give me hesitation if I were considering investing in a Mac Pro. It might make me think, okay, maybe I can get by with an iMac for a few years and then maybe wait for the first Apple Silicon Mac Pro. I am reminded of what's called the Osborne effect, which when described generically means a company announces a forthcoming product which siphons off sales of the current generation as people wait for that next thing to happen. And the term originated with reference to the Osborne company that announced its next computer, which turned out to be a year or so off, and sales of the current generation just died, and the company went out of business without ever having released the subsequent computer. So the strategy of pre-announcing hardware can really backfire. Apple has enough of a fan base that it's probably not going to suffer something quite that severe, but I'm in an odd position, and perhaps you feel similarly.
Yeah, I do. Even though I'm very much a PC user, I recently moved to Reaper, and Reaper is, of course, cross-platform. Before that, I was on Cakewalk Sonar, which was Windows only, but now I'm not as attached to Windows as I used to be. And I'm in kind of a similar situation to you. You have your Trashcan Mac Pro, which is 2013 hardware. I have a similar setup where I'm using these circa 2013, 2014 HP workstations, and they're great. I do feel like this is just enough power to handle my pretty big orchestra template if I need to, as well as do sound design and play some of these modern games that are coming out. Yes, these are old processors, but at least I could put like a somewhat high-end video card in it, and I can play modern games, and that's really important for game development, of course. But still, it is 7-year-old hardware, and I am thinking about the future. How much longer do I really want to rely on this? And I am worried about what the move to new hardware will be. As much as I'm looking at the new Mac Pro and other workstations, I also feel like I have to look at what's going on in the iPad space. Because when you say Apple Silicon, the only stuff that's really out there on the market is iPad, iPad Pro, iPhone. And there is a really interesting set of apps that are available for iPads and iPhones. You know, there is a version of GarageBand that runs on iPad. There's a version of Cubasis that runs on iPad. There are dedicated synthesizers that you could drive with the MIDI into it, or with other USB peripherals, because the new iPad Pro, as Apple is want to say, is just as powerful as your typical laptop, desktop, at least consumer class devices like that. And I'm still not sure what to think about it. It's such a different thing. I have a hard time actually moving my brain into that right space in order to make some sort of decision as to what the future really has in store for me. I mean, Alex, you're primarily a PC person, right? So, like, have you really thought much about this from where you are?
Yeah, a lot actually. It's a timely topic for me too because I prefer Mac, and I used to be primarily for audio production. I used to do it all on Mac, and I've had a variety of different Macs before, and I had to transition to Windows just because I needed the GTX 1080 for the VR stuff that we do, and everything VR and Unity, Unreal, all of that is game development is kind of PC centric. So this big thing that I'm talking to you on now is a PC, but I also have this guy here, which is a 2015 MacBook Pro, and it's kind of on its last legs now. It's still going, and it's still kind of chugging along, but the you can definitely tell, okay, pretty soon now this guy is going to go cactus, and the fan will just sort of spontaneously turn on for no reason, and like there are other sort of various things about it saying, okay, it's time to get a new Apple computer. The thing is just that nowadays I only use my Mac. I use it primarily just for accessing stuff in Logic, and also for just basically business stuff, because for business stuff and email and file handling, I very much prefer Mac over Windows. So I do need a new MacBook. So then that puts me in kind of the same position as you. It's like, okay, well, now comes this Apple Silicon stuff. You can, apparently, I think at the end of this year, the rumors say that we're going to be seeing the very first Apple ARM devices coming at the end of the year. But I don't know whether it's worth waiting or that. I mean, Apple says that there's going to be, there's still about 2 or 3 years, I don't know if it's 3, maybe 2 years of life left in Intel compatibility. So if you buy a machine now, this one is 5 years old and it's going great, which means that if I buy a MacBook Pro, let's say I buy a MacBook Pro tomorrow, then potentially there's at least 2, maybe 3 years of use in there, and software will be required to actually seamlessly switch between Intel or ARM depending on what it's run on. So for the most part, maybe you won't really notice that much of a difference. It just really comes down to the point of, well, yeah, 3 or 4 years into the future, am I going to have to abandon what I buy tomorrow because everything is heading towards ARM? And I think a lot of us Apple users sort of have bad memories of the old PowerPC to Intel transition as well. Although arguably this transition is probably going to be a bit smoother and a bit more seamless, or even more smoother and even more seamless than the PowerPC to Intel transition was. But yeah, I'm also a bit lost too. Like I could actually justify buying a new computer tomorrow, but then maybe it's better to wait. I really don't know.
And this is the Osborne effect, that doubt that you're feeling. I think we can use rudimentary deduction to make some inferences about what Apple Silicon will be happening at the end of the year. We know, for example, or we don't know, but we can guess rationally that we're not going to see a new Mac Pro because the people who just spent $7,000 on an Intel Mac Pro 6 months ago would then go up in arms. We just saw some iMacs released, so we're probably not going to see an iMac. Yeah. We could potentially see an iMac Pro successor. That's possible, but there's a lot of debate as to whether the concept of an iMac Pro was kind of a one-time thing as a stopgap when people were waiting for the Mac Pro and there had not been a Pro quality Mac released in 3 years. So that's something Apple offered like 2017 just to fill time. So my guess is that first Apple Silicon we're going to see is kind of a consumer grade laptop, like the successor to the MacBook Air, either a medium range or even low end consumer oriented laptop. That seems to be a reasonable guess. So if what you're looking for, Alex, is a replacement for your non-music intensive laptop, and you can get by on the old smoke coming out of the sides, fan triggering randomly 2015 MacBook Pro that you've got, you might want to see if you can just squeak by until January, because you might find there's a brand new replacement coming out around then.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking to do. But actually, it's one thing that Vince mentioned just now had me thinking as well, that because primarily I use the Mac as a business machine. So for taking to meetings, doing presentations, file wrangling, email, because call me crazy, but I really like Apple's email client. So with that in mind, maybe the iPad is also a good option, because for just that kind of business use, the iPad is looking very strong. And if you're not going to be using it for sort of production duties, actually, even if you wanted to, you could. Granted, there aren't too many options in the in the flavor of DAW that you guys know I love. That is basically anything tracker. There's not so many options on the iPad for that, but that aside, maybe the iPad is a better choice if really sort of business use is the main thing that's for. Actually, speaking of trackers, in the chat on YouTube, we are graced by the honourable presence of Mr. Alexander Brennan himself,
Yes.
who says that. He says also that he doesn't use his MacBook a ton, and it's still kind of kicking on after all these years. But maybe like an iPad could be a good option if people like us who are not using the Macs for production, but just like it for business usage. Maybe the iPad is a good option. Vince, do you think in your case, if you got the iPad, like how would you balance your use of that together with your big grunty PC workstation?
Yeah, I do have a MacBook right here. It's pretty good for doing the usual office administrative type stuff. Oh, I've got to do some talking with people on Slack or on Zoom. I've got to do emails. I've just got to do basic communication stuff. It's very good for that. It's also really overkill. I mean, this is a really heavy-duty MacBook Pro with the big graphics card upgrade, 16 gigs. It's nice. And there's no reason why I can't do all that stuff with an iPad, with a keyboard. That's what my wife uses a lot these days. She's got an iPad Pro from a couple years ago. She added a Logitech keyboard. It's enough computing for so many people. It's really quite amazing how good that thing is. Yeah, I think when we see Apple Silicon, it's probably going to be in a consumer grade device. I know that the developer units that have been shipped out to all the people that are interested in developing specifically for Apple Silicon, they're all using these Apple A12Z chips, which are basically some slightly differently clocked versions of the chips that are used in the high-end iPad Pro these days. And that's probably going to be not far off from what we see in MacBooks, Mac Minis, and yeah, those types of consumer-grade devices that we might get a whiff of end of this year, beginning of next year. I'm kind of excited for that. I think it will be really interesting when it comes to that, but what will happen on the professional level? The iMac Pro, I know it had a very mild upgrade offered this year, but I don't think it was really that meaningful. And so maybe we're not going to see another iMac Pro. I do wonder about the Mac Pro itself, because there were so many things that they talked about with the Mac Pro, not just in terms of its configuration, but in terms of those expansion cards that they made specifically for it. I know a lot of it was targeted at people that were doing 3D rendering and video, but they're going to have to support that Mac Pro for a while longer. It's not quite the same as, say, the American automotive industry, where after a car is no longer in production, you still are required as a company to maintain that car, to create parts for it for the next 15 years, I believe. But I think Apple does have to support those pro Mac users that are going to be tied to that Intel chip for quite a long time.
It is kind of an awkward transitional moment. And circling back briefly to the topic of the iPad, there have been a lot of reviews in particular of the new keyboard that Apple released for the iPad Pros, the iPads Pro, and that have turned a lot of the pundits to the position that you can now finally really use it as your primary computer. The new keyboard is apparently good enough that it closes that gap productivity-wise if you've got the software you need. So for your basic utilitarian functions, an iPad Pro with the Apple keyboard or even one of the Logitech ones may be a viable choice. But yeah, the question with supporting the that was the Mac Pro was the new hotness that was revolutionary, and some of the excitement's been taken away from it. There's a very interesting question to audio producers or audio creators, because we don't need the same amount of firepower that video people do. We're just not moving as much data. And I think if you were buying a new primary computer today and you were picking a Mac, the non-Pro iMac would be a pretty good choice for most purposes. From what I've read, the kind of top configuration of the new iMac is comparable or better to the iMac Pro of yesteryear. So you're not really losing out a lot by not getting an iMac Pro. And it gives you a hefty amount of power without the massive investment of a Mac Pro, and less of a feeling of having invested in something that's going to be obsolete conceptually in a few months. So I feel like either that or maybe a juiced up laptop, if you're doing stuff that's not as processor intensive, might be the best choice.
Mm-hmm.
I can't help but wonder whether this transition would have been different if the famous and infamous industrial legend Jonathan Ive hadn't left. I kind of wonder whether that actually has sort of played into this in some form or other. I mean, it makes complete sense from a production point of view for Apple to move to their own silicon for all of the reasons. Like, it's totally logical. But then it's such a, like, as you've pointed out, like, after releasing, one of the clearest definitions of a boutique computer, which of course is the Mac Pro, the cheese grater with its like $800 wheels. Wasn't $800 for the wheels?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. After having released that, then such a short time, relatively speaking, in the bigger scope of all these kinds of things, a short time later saying, oh, by the way, we're going to be completely changing out the whole CPU of this entire system. So, good luck with that $6,800 purchase that you made there. But don't worry, we'll be supporting it for 2 more years. So it's like, that's a bit, I don't know. Could it have been done better? What do you think, Vince?
I mean, 6,800 is one thing. The top end Mac Pro is a $50,000 machine. That's really crazy. And certainly if I spend that type of money, hey, we're still going to be supporting this for a couple years. Don't worry. I would be just tearing out my hair if I still had some. It's kind of ridiculous, but also it does make me think a little bit about how quickly music software technology has changed in the last few years. It certainly has changed a lot looking at the grand scheme of things, the 20, 30 years ago, right? You go back 25 years, and what was the standard then? Akai samplers and romplers and whatnot. You're loading things from floppy disks and CD-ROMs into however many megabytes of RAM you have installed in your sampler at the time. And then, I mean, we were at Mac System 7 probably around that time. And then you get into the Power PCs of 2000 or so, and things were getting better. We had some interesting things, Gigasampler, whatnot. But things are actually moving really fast. The big companies are moving really quickly when it comes to their technology. And all these small companies are coming out of the woodwork just making different sorts of audio tools by themselves, their own plugins, or libraries for companies like that Native Instruments Contact will load in. Maybe we're underestimating how quickly the rest of the software industry will move in order to accommodate whatever hardware move Apple makes. I mean, this is a very different software development world now than it was 20 years ago when we were looking at that big and honestly very poorly handled transition from Motorola to Intel.
Yeah, actually, I think from the point of view of developers, I don't know, but I from what I've heard, from the point of view of developers, Apple is making the transition fairly smooth, or as smooth as they could compared to that PowerPC to Intel transition from before. And of course, having the system using whatever fancy name that they came up with, I forget now, switch automatically if you're using legacy code, and that will be supported for some years to come as well, while you sort of have several years to update your code to a new code base. Yeah, it seems like hopefully things may go a little bit smoother than they did with the transition to Intel.
Well, Apple is providing, I think it's Rosetta 2, named after the same translation, the real-time translation system they used for the PowerPC to Intel. But even if it's a fairly fluid and flawless interpreter, there's a question of whether audio software with its real-time needs could rely on that kind of middleware to translate it. And my guess is no, that wouldn't be a great idea. Something like Pages or Numbers, those non-real-time intensive apps could probably get by. It's a terrible example because obviously Apple will port its own first-party applications, but things that aren't really juggling a lot of data in real time can get by with Rosetta, I'm guessing. But I think plugin developers are going to want to recode and optimize as well as they can for Apple Silicon. I feel like the heavyweights can be relied upon to do that. We know we'll get a good translation of Contact and Pro Tools and everything else. But those companies have also been historically very slow to give those updates. So it may be a very strange time where Native Instruments is issuing these alarmed emails that say, we, like you, just found out 6 hours ago that the new Mac Pro with Apple Silicon has been released. Don't buy one if you're going to use Native Instruments because we just got our dev kit right now and nothing compiles. And so, it may be one of those really awkward moments where all the plugin manufacturers are emailing you at once, telling you not to upgrade.
Yeah, I was going to say, it almost feels like as an Apple user producing audio, like most people would be kind of used to that because pretty much every OS update that Apple does breaks something. And it's kind of like, don't update yet, and nobody update because nothing works yet.
Yeah.
And then, a few months later, you get you go to KVR and there's like this big thread at the top with like 500 pages to it saying like, plugins that are safe for upgrading to Catalina or whatever the OS is flavor of the month.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Maybe that could rear its head even more than we've seen in the past. And we've got the double whammy as game audio. It's not just plugins, but things like our game development utilities, Fmod Studio, Wise. Those have had some issues in the past when it comes to those versions. Yeah. Okay. So it's tough on the real time front. I do think during one of those Apple conferences, I still don't even remember the name of these conferences. WWDC is one thing, and then there's another thing, etc. But when they were showing Rosetta 2, I do remember that this was a really good showing. The fact that they were using a video game, I think it was Tomb Raider or Rise of the Tomb Raider, as an example of how well Rosetta 2 works. And that's great. That's real time, right? And it is sort of. I don't even think that particular demo was running at 60 frames per second. And if it was 60 frames per second, that means, all right, 16.6 milliseconds. You've got that window in order to do stuff. Most sound and music producers that I know would say that 16 milliseconds is actually on the high side. We're used to things like 24-bit, 96 kilohertz, 128 samples. What? Oh, that's too large. Let's make it 64 samples. I want to be able to hear my sound within 3 milliseconds of me hitting the keyboard. And while that seems obscenely short, it is also pretty natural. We're used to that as musicians. This is what a piano sounds like. And so the difference between 3 millisecond response and 15 millisecond response can really seem like an eternity and could turn you off from using a particular system. It certainly turns people off from various other purchases that they make. Hey, am I going to use this software or am I going to use this audio interface? And those are similar scale of purchase of opting into a particular system as this new world that Apple has been teasing with Apple Silicon. So a lot of questions.
Yeah. Speaking of Apple, have you both been monitoring the legal battle that's going on between Apple and Epic? It's pretty to be honest, it's kind of hard to know who to side with because on the one side you see Apple. It's like, I mean, that's massive monopoly on everything. But hey, it's their store, and they're going to charge 30% for things that you do in there. And as a developer, you sign an agreement saying that okay, when somebody pays money into the system, then Apple gets 30% of that. So that's the one side of things. And then if Epic comes along and says, "Oh no, we're going to circumvent that with our own payment that goes around Apple's cut," then yeah, you could say that, well, Apple has every right to stand up and say, wait a moment, that's not part of our agreement, and that's not a part of the agreement for any developer. And just because you're Epic doesn't mean that you can have special treatment compared to any of the other developers who are paying this. Then on the other side of it is Epic's side of it, which is where, yeah, I mean, the Apple's monopoly over this, and I think actually Epic were targeting both Apple and Google, I think, in their sort of campaign that they're running here. It's also nice in Epic fashion to have some kind of shake-up and a disruption of this, potentially to get people talking about, the whole structure of how these stores are set up and how fair or unfair that is to game developers across the board, let alone whether you are Epic or whether you are, the one-person indie shop. Have you been following any of these developments, Mike?
Well, I read about 10 Apple blogs a day. So yes, I have kept abreast here. I think there's an interesting distinction between the moral argument, the ethical argument, the veneer of which Epic seems to be adopting for its case, and the more pragmatic, to quote Russell Peters, "This is more than the amount I wish to pay," which is a much more self-centered kind of argument. And even though Epic is waving the class action lawsuit flag, the fact is they quietly asked Apple initially for a special exception for themselves, and Apple said, no, of course not. So that kind of shows that they're much more pragmatic and much less community-minded than I think they are portraying themselves as. And I mean, ultimately, they signed a contract that said, sure, you can have 30% of whatever we sell. We agree to your terms. It seems pretty cut and dry. There are many arguments to be made that Apple could lower its cut of apps sold through the App Store, or maybe come up with like a sliding scale so that indie developers are treated more gently than established developers. I think there are a lot of arguments that could be made, and they could be framed as being in Apple's advantage in creating a community that's more welcoming to certainly to indie developers. But to act as if it's a legal violation of somebody's rights to be expensive, I think that's very misguided, and I think it's kind of dishonest, honestly.
Yeah.
What do you think, Vince?
Well, it's I'm not sure if I've been paying attention quite as closely, but there are some interesting things that I've noticed. Well, one, Epic is definitely prepared for a legal battle. I know that there's not a real lawsuit here yet. I understand that it's just a legal complaint being filed as opposed to a legal brief or an actual lawsuit. So it's just one step, but it does seem like one clear step on the way, because it feels like Epic was very prepared for this type of response from Apple. Like they got all these things set up, like structurally public facing. They've got this. There's this thing called the Epic Newsroom that has only been open for about a month or so, but it contains a lot of the information that Epic is trying to put out there in support of why they are acting as they are. I think one of the really interesting things that I've been seeing recently are these comparisons between a theoretical case of Apple versus Epic and what happened with Microsoft in Europe. In terms of how Microsoft conducted themselves. Now, of course, there isn't this explicit money thing that is happening. The relationship between Apple and Epic is actually rather more clear. The Epic signed a contract compared to the relationship between Microsoft and other developers that are developing for the Windows platform back in the early 2000s. But there are a lot of places where it seems like Apple is possibly doing the exact same things that Microsoft was flagged for, that made Microsoft be considered this operating antitrust. The way that, for example, the App Store is a thing that cannot be uninstalled, the same way that Windows Media Player and Microsoft Internet Explorer could not be uninstalled. Or doing these comparisons between Apple and Google. How will a Google Epic showdown actually fare versus an Apple Epic showdown? And showing how that comparison doesn't just show how much more difficult the potential lawsuit is there between Google and Epic, because those the frameworks for those phones and those stores are totally different. Google can't, or generally chooses not to, block things that are not on the Google Play Store from being installed, versus Apple, which does in fact actively block. Okay, that's interesting. But what about that active blocking? How does that actually compare to other legal precedent that exists? And again, looking at Microsoft, there's some really interesting reading there. I haven't gone too far into it, just because if I did, I'm not sure I would get any music work done, and I had to get some done over the weekend. But man, this is going to be an interesting case. I'm going to try to keep my ear to the ground on it and stay up to date on what's going on.
Yeah, I think personally, I kind of I agree with Mike. I think, like I said a few minutes ago, I think that it's nice to have this kind of, or it's let's be honest, it's exciting to have this kind of sort of disruption, because you sort of think of all this potential of change and what's going to happen, like how are things going to change? Are Apple going to change their policy, or is every Unreal game going to be booted off the App Store, or what's going to happen? It's kind of exciting from a kind of a what's the term? Disaster voyeurism. I think is the term. So from that point of view, it's exciting, and potentially there's some good to come out of it. But I think, as Mike said as well, from the layperson's point of view, it's like, all right, you're on Apple's App Store, you signed an agreement. This is the way Apple runs its App Store. So you can't just sort of be upset and say, no, you must make an exception for me and for everybody, because this is what is ethical. It's like, it's... Yeah.
I got to admit, I thought that 1984 parody thing that Fortnite did was kind of silly. I mean, I got it. I got that it was a reference to the Apple ad, but seriously, really? Huh?
Does anyone who plays Fortnite familiar with were they alive in 1984?
Exactly. I was just about to say that. It's like it was obviously clearly, as Vince, as you said, it was like clearly all planned out in advance. Okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, then we're going to need some kind of video to mobilize the Fortnite community. So let's go and reference a video from ages ago that none of them have probably seen. Reference an advertisement that none of them have probably seen from Apple. That'll do the trick. Yeah.
Interestingly,
anyway.
eBay is apparently now aflood with iPhones that have Fortnite installed on them.
Yes, I saw that.
I love, just from a kind of economic standpoint, I love the unintended consequences of giant actions like this that impact multiple markets, and it is fascinating.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's say we move on to something far more consequential.
Ooh, more consequential.
And more consequential, far more wide-reaching and world-changing, and that is Mike.
Oh, we're doing
Are we going to talk about the system? I've heard.
Are we talking about the system?
I want to talk about the system. Please tell us about the system, Mike.
So, all right, I'm going to try to frame this in a way that, instead of being a self-indulgent narrative about myself, since that's what I normally speak, I'm going to try to frame this in a way that's useful to other people. So please keep me on the straight and narrow. And if I start not being interesting to people who aren't me, maybe make some kind of gong sound.
Okay.
Generally speaking, I feel like there's a crisis in patch management right now. And by patch, I mean that in the most generic sense of a particular software instrument with a particular sound option. I don't necessarily mean what Logic calls a patch, which is a particular implementation of that concept and a packaging of a channel strip with a lot of extrinsic stuff like articulation sets. But in the most general sense, it's very hard to keep an organized collection of accessible sounds across different sound libraries with a uniform interface. So if you've got a whole bunch of contact libraries, let's look at the case of synth sounds. You've got perhaps a bunch of different libraries in contact, and you've got stuff by SampleSum that's kind of its own player, and maybe you've got some stuff by Output, which uses contact, but it has its own interface. At least within the using Logic as a DAW, it is very difficult to efficiently set up a big directory of sounds that is organized in an efficient way and makes it easy to get sounds and flip through them quickly. You can, of course, open up a plugin. You can flip through all its presets, but that means there's a different interface for every library or every plugin. And let's say you just want synth strings, and you want to be agnostic about what is creating those strings. Maybe you've got some stuff from Omnisphere and you've got some stuff from Logic's built-in suite. How do you make a big list of everything and not care where it came from? Well, Logic does provide a mechanism for doing that. There are actually 3 different mechanisms, but that requires loading up every single patch in Omnisphere or whatever, and then saving it in a special format that Logic uses. You can create either a channel strip or a patch, and that is prohibitively time consuming. I'm not going to go through thousands of sounds and individually save them as something that Logic understands. So I was trying to figure out how I could organize my sounds in a way that I felt like they were accessible to me, so that if I wanted a pad, I didn't have to stop and think, like, where are all my pads? There's some in contact and some in output stuff and some in Omnisphere and some of, it was slowing me down so much that it was causing a big speed bump in my productivity. So I cycled through a couple of options. I thought about, you guys may remember this, I thought about literally ditching everything except Omnisphere where synth sounds were concerned. And I figured I'll just have one library with its own internal system of organizing and just use that for everything. And then I decided, no, I've got years of filed synth sounds and processed acoustic audio, and I don't want to just ditch them for the convenience of a uniform interface. So then I took a look at Unify, which is a new kind of plugin wrapper offered by, you guys may know this, but Plugin Guru. And what it purports to be is something like Logic's patch system, just sort of an abstraction where you can save anything made by any library as a thing, and you have a library of things, and you can actually give them tags, which Logic does not have, and categories, and lots of meta-organizational features. And I looked at that as a solution and said, let's just import everything I ever use into this new system. And the problem there is, of course, similar to Logic in that it requires loading and saving a huge number of sounds. And the price you get for that uniform interface is just a prohibitive amount of work. So I thought, well, okay, I'll just bite the bullet and use each plugin's individual interface. Or I can use the AU preset system in Logic, which kind of gives you a way of looking at patches within a specific plugin, and you don't have to open the plugin. You can kind of see a directory in Logic. And I won't go into why that's inconvenient, but you basically would have to click on a given plugin to see the presets for that particular plugin. So you would lose the universality of seeing all your synth strings across all your libraries, et cetera. So I wrangled with this for a long time because I just wanted something that was efficient and that would let me organize everything by category and wouldn't bog me down and wouldn't take 5 seconds to switch between one patch and another, which tends to happen when you're using Logic's patch system. Mm-hmm. And after all this wrangling, I came up with the perfect universal system of patch management. Mm. It is called a text file. That's right. I've come up with the most primitive zero-text system of patch organization, which is simply making a list, a glorified list. Now, this approach is based on one important thing. Logic has a very efficient search mechanism. So if you open up what it's called its library window and start typing, it'll start matching whatever you see to what you type. So if you type SYN, every patch that has SYN or synth or something like that will appear. So it's actually very efficient to, if you know what you're looking for, to type something in and get that thing. And that's what makes the text file system work with Logic. I suspect it would work with everything else. But crazy as this sounds, hear me out. You as a person probably have a set of categories of sounds that match how you think of audio. You think synth basses, or weird transitions that have a swell, or patches that are simple and transparent and can coexist with orchestra, like pads, or pads that are really thick and are changing. Like, you have these categories. Everyone has their own categories of how they think of music. And you can create, obviously, if you have a text file, you can create arbitrary categories and just start listing patches under those categories, and you can sort them arbitrarily. So if you've got your top 5, you can just say, these are my top 5 synth pads that are transparent and coexist with with acoustic strings. Or here's my favorite crescendo style transitions, and or here are impacts, and you subdivide them by tonal or atonal. You can just make a list, and you can annotate it arbitrarily, and you can sort it and recategorize it. And you can make notes to self. I used this in Head Exploder 5 when I was scoring that. You can organize things on text and then simply type the name of a patch into Logic's search field, or hopefully other DAWs have something equivalent. And the advantage of this is you're relying on your head, your memory as an organizational scheme, and you are using that as a way to quickly and efficiently guide you to the category of sound you want. Your text file will exist in another window, so it's not subject to the interface of your DAW. If you quit out of your DAW, your list is still there. It's infinitely flexible and organizable. And having used this for a little while, I'm finding it's actually helping my workflow quite a bit. Confession, I'm not literally using a text file. I'm using Omni Outliner, which is a fairly lightweight outlining app. It's Mac only. I'm sure comparable things exist for PC, but it gives you indenting categories and subcategories and collapsible categories and a filtering system. So you can organize things and move them around a little more easily than if you had a lot of patches listed in text. But I've been using my zero tech or extremely low tech solution for a couple of weeks, and by gum, I feel like my collection of sounds is more accessible to me mentally than it ever has been. I don't feel like I'm drowning in sounds, and I don't feel like I have to dig through 1,000 different libraries and negotiate different interfaces and deal with names like effervescent slapfest, these kind of arbitrary names that you get for synth sounds that have no descriptive power whatsoever. Because I can type effervescent slapfest. This is kind of a bubbly sound. Use this when you have a good mood kind of cue. Works well with acoustic woodwinds. You can annotate them and organize your sounds in a way that reflect how you think of them. And as a little asterisk, a nice thing about Omni Outliner is you can kind of use it as a tagging system. It doesn't have tags per se, but it does have filters that serve comparably. So I can now tag patches by what projects I've used, so that if I switch to a project, I can just put on a filter that says, show me all the musical sounds I'm using for Head Smashers 3, and then I'll just see the subset of my text file that has those. So, and if I decide to change DAWs, my library comes with me. I don't have to reconfigure it. It's the ultimately portable sound organizational system. So the only thing it relies on is that you can type in the name of a sound and search efficiently, which happens to be true with Logic. But if you, person out there, are drowning in options, if you feel like when you're in the thick of working on a project, you don't actually have time to search for sounds anymore, and you just end up using whatever 5 you saved, whatever presets you saved in a directory, I would suggest trying this out experimentally. You might find it's the most effective way to get at your sounds in a way that makes sense to you personally. I will now entertain questions from my colleagues.
That
Fantastic.
was actually great. That's cool. I mean, I'm not a Logic user. I've got to admit, I don't really have too much of an issue myself when it comes to searching my library for synth sounds. But I still feel like I got some really valuable takeaways from this. One, hey, Omni Outliner actually looks kind of cool. But besides that, really thinking about how the fact that I really don't have any sort of mental map for how things are organized when it comes to the wider library of sounds I have available. Certainly within the orchestral template, I know those things very, very well, but it's also very limited compared to everything else that's out there. And I do rely on everything else that's out there, and they are really disparate. Like my Korg soft synths, I want to load up my Korg soft synth wave station, and I know I have a sound there that sounds really similar to something that's in my Proteus soft synths, which are totally different. Darn it. And I know I have to spend some time searching for that thing, and I will find it, and it will take me 20 to 30 minutes. It just will. And I don't mind too much because that time's cool. I enjoy reminding myself of the sounds that I've got. That's also useful learning time, but it's certainly not very efficient. And just the fact that you've got this pretty low tech solution for this, but more than that, you actually spent time into creating this mapping of how you look at everything that you've had to the actual stuff that you've got. And that's great. And I feel like I'm not sure if I want to follow this model, but I know that after hearing you go through this process, it feels like it would be a really good process for me as well to see what I can do in order to map and create a better understanding of everything that I have out there.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, Mike. Like a few weeks ago, I think when you first started to deal with this issue, you were sort of messaging us saying, how do you guys do it? Like when you were searching for the solution that you've now found? I was actually extremely fascinated by the problem to begin with, because I was trying to think, why don't I ever have a similar situation where as you said at the end of your excellent infomercial there, like, do you feel like you're drowning in synth sounds and you can't find what you want, or you spend so much time searching for the right sound? And I was trying to sort of think, why is it that I've never ever experienced that? I think it could be, in my case, it could be two reasons. Number one, the DAW that I prefer to work in for music, which is Renoise, that is essentially it's a tracker, which means essentially it's a sampler with a sequencer. So that means that whenever I'm losing a VST, I can get 200% more control over the synth if it is multi-sampled, as opposed to if it is just live running as a VST. So therefore, what I will tend to do is if I'm going through my soft synths and I find a really good sound, this is the one, I love it. Or if I just find something that I'm using in a song, Renoise has like an automatic multi-sampling feature. So you just press a few buttons, press go, and it will render it into a Renoise instrument, which is basically just like a contact instrument. This is a multi-sampled instrument. So that is now the VST. It's sampled, which means I have all that additional control inside Renoise being a tracker. And then I can just store that file where I want as my own sort of patch library from all of my synths. So including hardware synths, because obviously when you sample a hardware synth, you're doing exactly the same process, just manually. So I guess for me, there's that reason. The second thing, which is a bit more fascinating, which probably warrants a discussion longer than the time that we have remaining in this show, is the idea that synths are somehow equivalent and all of the patches that they have can be compared on an equal footing. Because that I find very fascinating, because I don't see them that way. I think one reason that I've never experienced this problem is that the synths that I have, to me at least, all of them have a very distinct character. And so I know that if I want a bass, then I should be using Yuhi Basile because those basses sound a certain way. Or if I want a luscious pad, then like Pad Shop in Cubase or Omnisphere or Yuhi Hive or Zebra or maybe even like Chromophone or one of those, like those are the ones that I go to for pads. So And the same for like if I want like luscious analog style synths, I'll use Diva or Repro or one of those. So I've always seen my synths as being very, very different. So sure, a lot of them can cover a lot of bases and do a lot of different things, and there's some versatility there. But for the most part, I view them as being single-purpose instruments. That okay, this is the one that I go to for this flavor of sound, not necessarily a genre of sound, like just plucks or but this is the kind of feel that I want. So that's the synth that I should go to. So yeah, I think that's another reason why before I get to the point of thinking, oh, I need to get a synth string patch, but I have no idea where to start. Which one should I use? Normally, in my case, I'm usually thinking, well, of course, if it's a synth string patch, I should go directly to, Zebra or whatever. So yeah, I think that your system is really fascinating, but I also find it extremely fascinating that the actual original problem of feeling overwhelmed in patches and sounds, because that's something I've not ever experienced myself.
I'm going to guess that you think, because you are much more of a synth specialist than I am, I'm going to guess you think of synths in the way that I think of orchestral libraries, because I would never need an organizational system for my orchestral libraries because I know what everything sounds like. And I know if I want a delicate sound, I go to Spitfire. If I want something that's a little more beefy, I might go to ADO or I might go back to Hollywood Strings. And my process for that is exactly the process you described when thinking of your synth sounds, which makes sense. I'm much more likely to lump synths into broad categories because I don't have the refined palette you do. And I'm less capable of making those really fine-grained descriptions. So for me, it's very useful to have this for that kind of sound, whereas I don't think you would need them.
Yeah, that's actually in conversations between the three of you, three as in you, Mike, Vince, and Chase, often, you're talking about, oh, okay, what's a good bassoon library? Or like, where do you go to for a solo oboe? Or I need some luscious strings. It's always curious to me because from my point of view, when it comes to sampled orchestral instruments, like they kind of sound the same, don't they, guys?
Oh man.
Now, of course, some of them are really. I guess I view them in terms of quality. Like, okay, this one sounds extremely real, but I would never be able to view them orchestral libraries. That is in terms of timbre. Okay, this one they're both. If you take Spitfire, or if you take Cinesamples, or if you take, I don't know, I'm out of my depth here, so I'm just going to stop right there. But anyway, they're both extremely high quality, but this one has more of this kind of timbre, and that one has more of that kind of timbre. Yeah, that is. I guess I just don't have the experience to sort of know that. So I think your analogy is totally correct.
I was actually going to say something similar, except maybe it was connected to how I use and my particular taste when it comes to orchestral samples, because I got to admit, I think I manipulate my orchestra samples more by virtue of them being these libraries that require a lot more manipulation, physical modeling type stuff, like sample modeling, like Wallander. Whereas I love synths, and there are some synths that I can really dig deep into, but I'm also very much into the preset patches. So when I say Korg Wave Station, I'm thinking about those patches more than I'm thinking about how robust they are and how much I can dig into it. And let me change this layer up, and et cetera, et cetera. So, so yeah, I was going to make a similar comment there, but approach it from that particular perspective.
Also, I would just to end this, I would like to point out, I think it's worth mentioning that Omni Outliner is actually in itself an extremely powerful tool and extremely useful for a wide range of different kinds of features. So I would actually like to see your system, Mike, done actually with a text file, because I think that like the idea of like tagging and sort of real-time filtered searching and stuff like that, those are sort of very useful features that Omni Outliner offers. And of course, all the organization of being able to collapse a section into a title and have subsections and, custom columns and stuff like that, all the amazing things that Omni Outliner does. It would be great to see. It would be great to see the Shapiro method done with the absolute bare basics of a text file to see how much the system depends on specific features from Omni Outliner.
Well, it's funny you should mention that because I prototyped this system using Apple Notes, and it did not allow the same kind of tagging, though I think if you use Bear, which is a third-party notes competitor, you do get tags and could possibly work it in that way. But if you could do without tagging and you do without some of the interface conveniences like being able to collapse a category, I found Notes actually worked okay. I used a kind of outline-ish format, just using tabs, indentation, and I would use boldface when I wanted to draw my attention to a particular standout in a category. Like of these 10 sounds that go boosh, these two are great, so I boldfaced those. But I think this could be done with just the most rudimentary tools. And the Omni Outline approach is just a little bit of a layer of fancy atop of this very low-tech system.
Cool.
Very cool. All right. Well, man, we had a couple of other topics prepared for today, but we're probably going to have to move that to next month because this Game Audio Hour is already up. No, we can't have it finished right now. We got to say a little bit about what media we're consuming right now, right? Mike, are you playing any cool games? Have you listened to some cool music? Watched any cool movies recently?
Well, if you remember, I think a month or two ago, I said, hey, there's this game coming out called Ghost of Tsushima. This looks really cool. Sure enough, it has turned out to be pretty cool. So that is my game of choice. And I am enjoying the score, which is very elegantly done using a lot of ethnic percussion and winds and other indigenous instruments that give a sense of time and place. So much fun is being had with that one.
Yeah, that's really cool. I still haven't played Ghosts of Tsushima, but I have read a little bit about the score in particular. I think on Sony Santa Monica's website, you could check out some blog posts from the Sony music supervisor, some notes from the composer about the creation of the Ghost of Tsushima soundtrack. And it was really fun reading that and listening to some excerpts. And maybe one of these days I will play it. I'm currently not playing that game just because I'm too wrapped up in current game dev, and it's kind of frustrating that. What have I been properly consuming recently? Darn it. I've been reading Kindle books, honestly, late at night. I've been reading some interesting books about different perspectives on Japanese grammar if you're not a Japanese speaker. And I was like, okay, I've already had my my brain flipped over a couple of times just by reading about 50, 60 pages worth of that. So that's something. Sorry, it's not anything more exciting than that. But Alex, maybe you've got something exciting?
Actually, I've been studying the work of the producer Trevor Horn.
Trevor Horn's great.
Specifically his work with Yes. In the 80s. Very, very good. Actually, most of Trevor Horn's stuff is very, very good. But Yes, of course, being an amazing prog rock band with all of that experience, when you combine that with a producer like that, very interesting results. My kids really, really like a few of the Yes songs from the 80s. And so, actually, when they've been playing, I've been listening carefully. It's like, wow, that is some seriously good production. So that's what I've been listening to.
That's really awesome. I got to admit, when I think Trevor Horn, I know I tend to think more new wave stuff than I think prog rock. But I mean, that same era, obviously, two sides of that same coin of what music was at that time, and it was such an awesome time, though. So maybe that is going to be the direction I take myself as I try to re-immerse myself in some more fun music and away from the work that I've been doing recently. Ooh.
Sounds
yes. Good. And that has been a pretty great Game Audio Hour, and we're going to have to close it, though. Thank you to everyone that watched and listened today. We couldn't be here without you and your continued support. If you're new to this channel, Make sure that you like us on Twitter. You can follow us there on Twitter. You can continue to keep tabs on us on YouTube by following us, as well as here on Twitch. We're still broadcasting to both platforms simultaneously, and it's really cool to see the watchers on both sides. So thank you again for all of your support. We'll be back probably 2 weeks from now. So until then, bye.